If you read part 1, you already know I don't believe in flattering you. I believe in telling you the truth as cleanly as I can, the way a good friend does, not the kind of friend who pats you on the back and says everything you do is brilliant, but the kind who sits across from you at 2 in the morning and says, "You know what's really going on here, right?" Part 1 gave you 25 laws. We talked about power, manipulation, perception, and the invisible games people play. A lot of readers found it uncomfortable. Good. Discomfort is the feeling of something true pressing against something you weren't ready to see. But here's what part 1 didn't say. The deepest darkness isn't in other people. It's not in the manipulators, the narcissists, the power-hungry systems. The deepest darkness is the one you carry inside yourself, the one you've learned to manage so expertly that you've forgotten it's there at all. Part 2 goes deeper. We're not just talking about how people behave. We're talking about why, the psychological engines buried beneath the surface, the self-deceptions that run so quietly, you mistake them for personality, the collective blindness that holds entire societies in place. These are harder truths. They require more from you. But I think you're ready. Otherwise, you wouldn't have picked up this book. So let's go. Introduction. The deeper layers. When self-deception becomes a way of life. There's a psychological concept called motivated reasoning. It was formerly studied by Zevakunda at Princeton in the late 1980s, and what she found was both elegant and devastating. People don't reason their way to conclusions. They feel their way there first, emotionally, intuitively, defensively, and then use reasoning to justify what they already wanted to believe. The logic comes after. The conclusion came first. Think about that for a moment. Most of what you believe you arrived at through careful thought is actually the product of something older, faster, and far less rational. Your preferences, your fears, your wounds, these cast a vote before your conscious mind even enters the room. This isn't an insult, it's just how the brain works. We are not the perfectly rational agents we like to imagine. We are emotional beings with a powerful capacity for rationalization, which is not the same thing as reason. The 25 laws in this book are built on that foundation. Every chapter is, in some sense, about the gap between who we think we are and who we actually are. Between what we think is happening and what is actually happening. Between the story we tell ourselves and the story the evidence tells. I want to be clear about something important. These laws are not meant to make you cynical. The goal is not to show you that everyone is lying and nothing is real. The goal is something far more useful. Discernment. The ability to see clearly, to act from genuine understanding rather than unconscious reaction, and to build a life that is true rather than merely comfortable. There's an old idea in Stoic philosophy. The obstacle is the way. What blocks you teaches you. What you resist reveals you. In that spirit, every uncomfortable truth in this book is a doorway. You don't have to walk through it. But if you do, something on the other side will be waiting for you that wasn't there before. I've divided part 2 into 5 main sections, each targeting a different domain of human experience. Identity, relationships, communication, ambition, and the social systems that contain us. The laws build on each other. By the time we reach Law 25, the darkest truth of all, you'll understand why it had to be last. Read slowly. Take notes. Sit with the ones that make you want to close the book, especially those. They're the ones written for you. Part 1. The truth about identity and self-perception. How people construct, protect, and imprison themselves inside a false image. Law 1. People are not who they think they are. They are what they repeatedly do. We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act but a habit. Aristotle. Let me ask you something honest. When was the last time you described yourself using a word? Patient, generous, disciplined, kind, and then behaved in a way that directly contradicted it. Not once, not in a weak moment, but as a pattern, as a default, as the thing you almost always do. Most of us carry a self-image that is, to put it charitably, aspirational. We think of ourselves in terms of our intentions, our best days, our capabilities on a good afternoon. We are, in our own internal stories, far more patient than we actually are, far more generous, far more principled, far more clear-headed. The research on this is robust and uncomfortable. Roy Baumeister, one of the foremost researchers on self-perception, has spent decades documenting the gap between how people see themselves and how they actually behave. His conclusion: most people consistently overestimate their positive qualities and underestimate their negative ones. This isn't a character flaw, it's a feature of the human brain. The mechanism responsible is called positive self-bias, and it exists in roughly 80% of the population. We are, as a species, deeply invested in believing we are a little better than we are. The problem is not the bias itself. The problem is what it costs us. If you believe you are already disciplined, you don't work on your discipline. If you believe you are already generous, you don't examine your hoarding behaviors. The inflated self-image becomes a ceiling disguised as a floor. Here's the simpler, more honest alternative. Forget what you think you are. Look at what you do, not what you did once in your finest hour. What you do on Tuesday mornings when nobody is watching. What you do when you're tired and someone irritates you. What you do when keeping a promise becomes inconvenient. That behavior, the repeated, habitual, unremarkable behavior of your ordinary days, is who you are. This is actually good news, even though it doesn't feel like it at first, because behavior can be changed. Self-concept is notoriously resistant to change. It's defended by enormous psychological machinery. But behavior responds to intention, structure, and practice. If you want to know who you are, stop listening to what you say about yourself and start watching what you do. Then, if you don't like what you see, change the doing. The being follows. There's a practice worth trying for 1 week. Every time you lose patience, write it down. Every time you follow through, write it down. At the end of the week, you will have a much more accurate portrait of yourself than any personality test or self-reflection has ever given you. The gap between self-image and behavior is not a moral failing. It's information. Use it. The people who change their lives are not the ones who think better of themselves. They're the ones who watch themselves clearly and adjust accordingly. Law 2. Most people's personality is just unhealed trauma with a costume on. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Carl Jung. This is the one that tends to make people uncomfortable at dinner parties, but stay with me, because I'm not talking about dramatic, capital T trauma here. I'm talking about something far more common and far more insidious. Peter Levine, the trauma researcher and developer of somatic experiencing, defines trauma not as the event itself, but as the unprocessed nervous system response to any experience of overwhelm. Any moment where what happened to you is more than your system could fully integrate at the time. By that definition, most of us are carrying more than we realize. The child who learned that expressing anger resulted in punishment didn't become an angry adult. They became an overly accommodating adult who doesn't get angry and can't understand why their relationships feel hollow. The person who grew up in unpredictable chaos didn't become chaotic. They became a controlling adult who just likes things organized and can't understand why their need for control drives people away. Here is how it works. When a child experiences something painful that they lack the resources to process, the nervous system does something brilliant and terrible. It adapts. It creates a workaround, a behavioral strategy that reduces pain and increases survival in that specific environment. The problem is that the strategy gets baked in. It becomes automatic. It becomes, over time, what we call personality. The anxious attachment style of someone whose parent was emotionally inconsistent. The compulsive self-sufficiency of someone who learned early that needing things made them a burden. The perfectionism of someone who only received love as a reward for achievement. None of these are original character traits. They are adaptive responses that outlived their usefulness and got promoted to identity. Researchers at Harvard studied a cohort of adults over decades. and found that adverse childhood experiences, ACE, were among the strongest predictors of adult health outcomes, relationship patterns, and behavioral tendencies. The study, launched by Vincent Felitti in the 1990s, was so striking that the CDC eventually adopted it as a public health framework. The data showed that ACE weren't just psychological, they left measurable imprints on the immune system, cardiovascular health, and longevity. None of this means you are broken. It means you are human. The question is not whether your wounds shaped you. They did. The question is whether you've looked at them honestly enough to see where they end and where the actual you begins. Most people haven't. Not because they're cowards, but because looking is painful and the costume fits well enough. The first step is deceptively simple. The next time you find yourself saying, "I'm just like this," or "That's just who I am," pause. Ask, is this who I am? Or is this what I learned to do to survive? The answer will tell you something important. And if the answer is the latter, the follow-up question is equally important. Does this still serve me? Or am I still wearing armor for a war that ended years ago? Law 3. Confidence is mostly performance, until it isn't. Courage is not the absence of fear, it is acting in spite of it. Mark Twain. You've heard the advice, fake it till you make it. Stand like a superhero for 2 minutes before your job interview. Project confidence even when you're terrified. There's a reason this advice has survived decades of repetition. It works. Not always, not perfectly, but often enough. In 2012, social psychologist Amy Cuddy published research suggesting that holding power poses could actually shift hormonal profiles, increasing testosterone and decreasing cortisol. Her TED Talk became one of the most watched in history. The replication crisis later complicated her specific findings, but what endured in the broader research literature was something subtler and more interesting. Embodied cognition. The way you hold your body affects the way you feel. The way you speak, slowly, clearly, with pauses, affects how your brain interprets your own authority. What this means is that confidence is not purely internal. It has a behavioral loop. You act confidently. Your brain registers the behavior and updates its self-assessment accordingly. The performance is not separate from the reality. Performed long enough and consistently enough, it begins to generate its own evidence. But there's a catch that the motivational posters never mention. Performance-based confidence is fragile. It requires an audience, external validation to sustain the internal feeling. The moment the audience disappears, or worse, provides negative feedback, the whole architecture collapses. This is why so many apparently confident people are devastated by criticism in a way that seems disproportionate. The confidence was real, but it was built on reflected light rather than internal generation. Genuine confidence, the kind that persists through failure, criticism, and uncertainty, is built differently. It comes not from believing you will always succeed, but from trusting that you can handle failure when it comes. This distinction is enormous. Fragile confidence requires constant success. Durable confidence requires only the knowledge that you've been through hard things and survived them. The research on this comes largely from the work of Albert Bandura, whose concept of self-efficacy, your belief in your own capacity to handle specific challenges, has been replicated across cultures, age groups, and domains. Bandura found that self-efficacy is built primarily through mastery experiences, doing hard things and succeeding or failing and recovering. Not through affirmations, not through posture, through the actual lived experience of difficulty navigated. So yes, perform confidence when you need to. The performance is not hypocrisy, it's practice. But don't mistake the costume for the foundation. The foundation is built in the moments nobody is watching. When you do the hard thing anyway, when you fail and get up anyway, when you choose to stay in the difficulty long enough to learn something from it. That's where real confidence lives. Law 4. People cling to identities that no longer serve them. The snake which cannot cast its skin has to die. Friedrich Nietzsche. Imagine you're wearing a coat. You've had it for 20 years. It was perfect once. Warm, well-fitted, exactly right for the climate you lived in. But the climate changed. You moved somewhere warmer. The coat is too heavy now. You sweat inside it. It slows you down. But every time someone suggests you take it off, something in you recoils. That coat is yours. You know it. It knows you. Who would you be without it? This is what identity foreclosure feels like from the inside. The term comes from developmental psychologist James Marcia, who built on Erickson's work to describe the process by which people commit to an identity, a set of beliefs, roles, and self-concepts, without ever genuinely exploring alternatives. For some people, this happens in adolescence. For others, it happens after a single defining experience that gets calcified into who I am. The problem with foreclosed identity is not just that it prevents growth, it's that it requires active maintenance. Every experience that contradicts the self-concept must be denied, rationalized, or reframed. Every person who sees you differently becomes a threat. Every opportunity for change becomes an attack. You end up spending enormous psychological energy defending an image of yourself that may have been accurate once, but no longer reflects who you actually are or could be. Research by Carol Dweck at Stanford on fixed versus growth mindsets illuminates this beautifully. People with fixed mindsets, who believe their qualities are essentially unchangeable, don't just avoid challenges. They actively avoid information that might reveal limitations. They interpret failure as evidence of fundamental inadequacy rather than as feedback. The identity becomes a prison, but it's a prison they police themselves. The identities people cling to most fiercely are often the most outdated. I'm not a creative person, decided at age 12 when a teacher was dismissive. I'm bad at relationships, concluded after one painful breakup at 23. I'm not the kind of person who does that. A line drawn so long ago that nobody remembers why. Here's what makes this so difficult. Change feels like death. Not metaphorically, neurologically. The brain's sense of a coherent self is tied to prediction and pattern. When that pattern is disrupted, the brain generates a threat response that is neurologically similar to physical danger. This is why people sabotage their own growth even when they consciously want it. The new self feels unsafe because it is unknown. The key is to separate identity from behavior. You don't have to stop being you to try a new behavior. You don't have to renegotiate who you are to explore a new possibility. Start with a small experiment. I'm becoming a different person, but I'm trying something I haven't tried before. The ego can survive a trial. It cannot survive a total dismantling, nor should it. The goal is not destruction, it's growth, and growth, by definition, requires that something old must be shed. Law 5. Everyone is the hero of a story that often makes them the villain. Every villain is a hero in his own mind. Tom Hiddleston. Ask anyone about the worst conflict of their life, a breakup, a falling out, a family rupture, a betrayal, and they'll tell you a story. In that story, their own behavior will be logical, understandable, even noble. The other person's behavior will be puzzling, hurtful, and unfair. This is not lying. This is narrative self-bias, and it is one of the most universal and least examined features of human psychology. Michael Gazzaniga, the neuroscientist who pioneered split-brain research, identified what he called the interpreter, a module in the left hemisphere of the brain, whose function is to construct coherent narratives from the often incoherent raw material of experience. The interpreter doesn't care so much about accuracy. It cares about coherence. It cares about the story making sense, and specifically about the story making you the protagonist rather than the antagonist. Memory researchers Elizabeth Loftus and Ulrich Nieser have documented extensively how memory is not a recording, it's a reconstruction. Every time you remember something, you're actually rebuilding it. And in the rebuilding, your current emotional state, your current beliefs, and your current self-image all participate. The result is a memory that feels vivid and accurate and is partially neither. Over time, people literally rewrite their personal histories to cast themselves more favorably. The thing they said that was hurtful gets forgotten or remembered as justified. The moment they didn't show up gets softened. The pattern of behavior they repeated gets treated as a single exception. Meanwhile, the hurtful thing the other person said is recalled with crystalline precision and attached to their fundamental character. This isn't malice. It's the brain doing what brains do, maintaining a coherent sense of self across time. But the cost is enormous. It prevents genuine accountability. It makes real repair in relationships almost impossible. It traps people in conflicts that never resolve because both parties are starring in different movies of the same event. The antidote requires a skill that is genuinely rare, the ability to hold your own perspective and someone else's simultaneously, with equal skepticism toward both. Not to abandon your experience, but to hold it lightly enough to ask, what would this look like from the other side? What might I be missing? It requires a kind of ego flexibility that most people never develop because nobody teaches it, and the ego resists it instinctively. But the people who manage to practice it, the ones who can say, I may have been wrong about my role in this, are the ones who have genuinely loving relationships, genuine accountability, and genuine peace. Not because they are weak or self-abnegating, but because they are honest enough to let the story be complicated. Part 2. The truth about relationships and intimacy. The unspoken contracts, hidden wars, and quiet bargains beneath every connection. Law 6. People choose partners who confirm their beliefs about themselves. We accept the love we think we deserve. Stephen Chbosky. This is one of those laws that people encounter and immediately think, not me. I have high standards. I want someone who treats me well. And they're not lying. Consciously, they do want that. But the unconscious has a different voting block, and it votes for the familiar. Attachment theory, originally developed by John Bowlby in the 1960s, and later extended by Mary Ainsworth and Mary Main, has become one of the most robust frameworks in developmental psychology. The core finding is this. The patterns of relationship you experienced with your primary caregivers in early childhood become the template through which you experience all subsequent close relationships. This template is called your attachment style, and it operates largely below the threshold of conscious awareness. What this means in practice is deeply counterintuitive. People with anxious attachment styles, formed in childhoods where care was inconsistent, don't just tolerate partners who are emotionally inconsistent. They are drawn to them. The inconsistency feels like love because inconsistency is what love felt like when it was first being learned. The nervous system doesn't ask, is this good for me? It asks, is this familiar? Familiar registers as safe even when it isn't. The phenomenon is called repetition compulsion, and Freud, whatever you think of his broader work, identified something real here. People unconsciously recreate the emotional conditions of their childhood, not because they're masochists, but because they are attempting, at some deep level, to master an old wound by replaying it in a new context. The hope, unconscious and irrational, is that this time it will work out differently. Research by Russ Jeff and colleagues at the University of Waterloo demonstrated that people with negative self-concepts actively seek out partners who view them negatively and report feeling more satisfied in those relationships than in relationships where they are viewed positively. Not more happy, more satisfied. The distinction matters. The self-concept craves consistency, not warmth. The path out of this pattern begins not with finding a better partner, but with building a better self-concept. This is slower and less romantic than the self-help narrative usually admits. It requires therapy or deep self-examination or both. It requires sitting with the discomfort of being loved well when loved well doesn't feel familiar yet. It requires tolerating the anxiety that comes with emotional safety when anxiety has always been your baseline. But here is the thing I want you to hold on to. The pattern is not fate. Attachment styles are not fixed. The research is clear that earned secure attachment, security that is developed through therapeutic relationships, conscious effort, and positive relational experiences, is possible across the lifespan. You are not condemned to repeat what was done to you, but you do have to see it first. And seeing it clearly, without flinching, is where the real work begins. Law 7. Love is often possession wearing a romantic mask. Jealousy is simply and clearly the fear that you do not have value. Jennifer James. Here's a question worth sitting with. How much of what you call love is actually love? And how much is the need to not lose something you've come to depend on? This is not a cynical question. It's a clarifying one. Because the genuine article and the imitation feel almost identical from the inside, especially in the beginning. Both involve intense focus on another person. Both involve wanting to be near them. Both involve distress when they're absent. The difference only becomes visible under pressure, specifically under the pressure of the other person's freedom. Erich Fromm, in his 1956 masterwork, The Art of Loving, made a distinction that most people have never been taught: the difference between having and being. In having mode love, the beloved is an object, something to be possessed, secured, controlled. In being mode love, the beloved is a subject, a separate human being whose flourishing you genuinely want, even when it costs you something. Fromm argued that most of what passes for love in modern society is the former wearing the costume of the latter. Fear of abandonment is the engine under most possessive love. The work of Sue Johnson, developer of emotionally focused therapy, has shown through decades of clinical research that what looks like controlling behavior in relationships is almost always underneath it. An attachment cry, a desperate attempt to secure connection when the connection feels threatened. The controlling partner is not, at their core, a power-hungry tyrant. They are a frightened child who learned that love disappears and is doing everything they can to prevent that from happening again. This understanding is important for two reasons. First, it allows compassion for possessive behavior without excusing it. Second, and more practically, it shows that the behavior cannot be addressed at the level of the behavior. Telling someone with attachment anxiety to stop being controlling is like telling someone with a broken leg to just walk normally. The underlying structure has to be addressed. Real love, the kind that doesn't corrode over time, requires a level of self-sufficiency that most relationship advice never mentions. You have to be able to tolerate the separateness of another person. Their thoughts that are different from yours. Their needs that don't always align with yours. Their capacity to exist fully and freely without you. If that separateness makes you feel threatened, that's information about your own psychology, not evidence that something is wrong with the relationship. The test of genuine love is simple but stringent. Would you still want what's best for this person even if what's best for them wasn't you? Not as a rhetorical exercise, as a real question. The answer, if you sit with it long enough, will tell you a great deal about what kind of love you're actually capable of giving, and what kind you've been settling for receiving. Law 8. People test you constantly. They just never tell you the rules. Trust is built in drops and lost in buckets. Kevin Plank. You're in a relationship, romantic, professional, or platonic, and something odd keeps happening. Small provocations. Moments of emotional withdrawal that seem to come from nowhere. Requests that feel slightly unreasonable. Situations where the other person seems to be watching for your reaction more carefully than the situation warrants. What you're experiencing is a loyalty test. Almost nobody will tell you this. Not because they're being deliberately deceptive, but because most of the time they're not even conscious of doing it. The testing behavior is automatic, driven by past experience, and the very reasonable need to know whether you can be trusted before full vulnerability is extended. Attachment researchers call these attachment protests, behaviors that escalate until they produce either a reassuring response or a confirmation of the feared abandonment. John Gottman's 40-plus years of couples research at the University of Washington identified what he called bids for connection. Small, often indirect attempts to make emotional contact, and found that how a partner responds to these bids is one of the most reliable predictors of relationship quality and longevity. Couples who responded to bids positively turning toward stayed together at dramatically higher rates than those who ignored or responded dismissively, turning away. The tests take many forms. Someone picks an argument about something small to see if you'll stay in the room instead of shutting down or walking away. Someone becomes needy for a weekend to see if you'll pull back or lean in. Someone challenges your integrity in a low-stakes situation to see what you'll do when nobody is watching. Someone tells you something vulnerable and then monitors carefully whether you use it against them later. Here's what makes this dynamic so treacherous. The person being tested often doesn't know they're being tested. They respond to the surface behavior, the argument, the neediness, the challenge, and often respond defensively, which appears to the tester as a failed test, which increases their anxiety, which produces more testing behavior, which produces more defensiveness, and so on. The spiral can destroy a relationship that both people actually wanted. The way out requires two things simultaneously. First, some degree of awareness that this dynamic exists, that when someone is poking at you, there's often a question underneath the poking. Second, the capacity to respond to the question rather than the provocation. This sounds simple. It is not easy. It requires you to be secure enough in yourself that another person's anxiety doesn't immediately become your anxiety, and curious enough about their inner world to wonder what they're actually afraid of. When you can do that, when you can say beneath the argument, I see you're scared about something, and I'm not going anywhere. Most tests fail to destabilize. Not because you've passed some external standard, but because the actual question has been heard and answered. Law 9. Most relationship problems are the same problem. Two people refusing to be vulnerable. Vulnerability is not weakness. It is our greatest measure of courage. Brené Brown. Brené Brown spent years collecting data on human connection before she said something that stunned her own research team. Vulnerability is the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity. Not a nice to have. The birthplace. The place where those things are literally born. And yet we spend enormous energy avoiding it. We argue about dishes and finances, and whose family to spend Christmas with. We go silent for days over slights that we can't articulate. We become sarcastic, critical, distant, and busy. We do almost anything rather than say the sentence that is actually true. I'm scared. I need you. I feel like I'm losing you, and I don't know what to do about it. Why? Because vulnerability requires exposing the exact thing we are most afraid to lose. When you say I need you, you are simultaneously handing someone the evidence of your greatest weakness and hoping they won't use it. The rational brain looks at that calculus and votes against it every time. Too risky, too much exposure. Hold the line. Maintain the armor. The problem is that armor prevents everything. It prevents hurt, but it equally prevents love, because love requires access. You cannot be truly seen by someone you are successfully hiding from. The armor that protects you from rejection is the same armor that prevents connection. There is no selective permeability here. You're either in or you're out. Gottman's research identified 4 patterns that reliably predict relationship failure: criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. And all 4 are, at their core, armor. They are ways of managing the vulnerability of connection by going on the offensive or shutting down. They work in the short term at reducing the immediate feeling of exposure. They fail, over time, at maintaining anything worth having. The counterintuitive move, the one that almost nobody wants to make first, is to go vulnerable in the middle of conflict. Not to give in, not to capitulate, but to say the scared soft thing underneath the hard, defended thing. To step out of the argument and into the feeling. When you do that, I feel invisible, and what I'm most afraid of is that I actually am invisible to you. That's a sentence that can end 1,000 arguments. Not because it's magic, but because it's true. And the truth, spoken clearly, has a way of dissolving the scaffolding of defenses that people build around it. When one person steps out of the armor, the other person's armor usually follows. Not always, not immediately, but the research is clear. Vulnerability invites vulnerability. The question is always who goes first. Law 10. People leave long before they actually leave. The beginning of the end is the moment when someone stops trying. There's a moment in almost every relationship that ends. Romantic, friendship, professional, where, in retrospect, you can identify the real ending. It was not the day someone moved out or sent the final email or stopped returning calls. It was months or years earlier, when something shifted quietly in the interior. When someone decided, consciously or not, that the investment would no longer be made. Gottman called this negative sentiment override, the state in which a partner's positive behaviors are consistently interpreted through a negative lens because the accumulated emotional debt of the relationship has become too large. When you reach negative sentiment override, your partner can do something genuinely kind, and you will find a way to be skeptical of it. Their good behavior looks like manipulation. Their affection feels performative. Something has already been decided somewhere beneath the surface of conscious thought. The emotional withdrawal that precedes physical or formal leaving tends to follow a pattern. First, there is a gradual reduction in sharing. Fewer stories from the day, fewer opinions offered, fewer moments of spontaneous connection. Then comes the reduction of repair attempts. The moments after conflict where one person reaches out to restore connection. When repair attempts stop being made, or made and rejected, the relationship enters a critical phase. Then comes the parallel life construction. The person who is internally leaving begins to build alternative sources of meaning and connection. New friendships, increased investment in work, hobbies that don't include the other person, a gradual thickening of the wall between internal life and shared life. By the time any of this is visible, the leaving has been in progress for a long time. Research by researchers at the University of Texas found that people often report having known their relationship was ending an average of 18 months before they actually ended it. 18 months of going through the motions while the internal decision had already been made. This is not cruelty. It is the human tendency to grieve what we're losing while we're still holding it, and to avoid the pain of formal ending as long as possible. What does this mean for you, practically? Two things. First, the behaviors that precede emotional withdrawal, decreased sharing, reduced repair attempts, increased parallel life building, are signals worth attending to, in yourself and in others. If you're doing them, that's important information about what you actually want. If you're experiencing them from someone else, that's a conversation worth having while there's still something to save. Second, the formal ending is rarely the real ending. If you want to understand what happened, truly understand it, you have to look earlier. The argument that precipitated the breakup is almost never the reason for the breakup. It's the moment when someone who had already decided finally said so. The real story started long before that, in all the small moments of withdrawal that nobody named while they were happening. Part 3. The truth about language and communication. What is really being said beneath every conversation. Law 11. Most arguments are not about what they appear to be about. The thing about arguing is that each side thinks they are the one being reasonable. Anonymous. You've had the dishes argument, or the money argument, or the argument about being late, or the argument about tone, or the argument about not listening, and somewhere in the back of your mind, even as you're making your case, a small voice is asking, why does this matter so much? It matters because it's not about the dishes. Virginia Satir, one of the pioneering family therapists of the 20th century, spent her career documenting a simple pattern. Surface arguments are almost always proxy battles for deeper, unspoken needs. The argument about the dishes is an argument about feeling unappreciated. The argument about money is an argument about safety and control. The argument about tone is an argument about respect. The actual content of the argument, the dishes, the money, the tone, is a stand-in, a socially acceptable arena in which to fight a battle that neither party knows how to name directly. The brain researcher Matthew Lieberman at UCLA studies what he calls social pain. the neurological response to feeling excluded, dismissed, or disrespected. His brain imaging work showed that social rejection activates the same neural circuits as physical pain. This is not metaphorical. When someone argues with you about coming home late, their brain may actually be processing something that feels, neurologically, like getting hit. The argument isn't an overreaction. It's a pain response. Understanding this changes everything about how you argue, or rather, how you might choose not to argue. When you can recognize that the person across from you is in pain, rather than merely making a point, the entire dynamic shifts, and you can respond to hurt differently than you respond to logic. The technique that consistently works, validated by Gottman, by Satter, by virtually every reputable couples therapist, is to stop arguing the point and name the feeling. Not "you always leave the dishes," but "when the dishes are left, I feel invisible in this house. Like what I do here doesn't matter." That sentence is harder to say. It's much harder to argue against, because it's true and it's vulnerable and it names what the argument was actually about. This requires discipline. In the middle of conflict, your brain is flooded with cortisol and adrenaline. The amygdala is running the show. Your prefrontal cortex, the part that can hold complexity, empathy, and nuance, is running at reduced capacity. Daniel Kahneman's work on System 1 and System 2 thinking is directly relevant here. Conflict activates the fast, automatic, pattern-matching brain, not the slow, deliberate, nuanced one. Which means the most important thing you can do in any heated argument is not say the right thing. It's by time to let your brain get back online. A glass of water, a deliberate breath, 5 minutes alone. These are not avoidance tactics. They are neurological reset buttons. Use them. The argument will still be there when you get back. Except now you'll be able to have the real one. Law 12. People use humor to say what they're afraid to mean. Dying is easy, comedy is hard. Attributed to Edmund Gwen. There's a joke hidden in almost every serious thing a person can't quite say. The sarcastic comment about a partner's weight. The self-deprecating humor that circles the same wound every time. The joke about quitting the job that everyone laughs at, a little too hard, a little too fast, because something in it rang true. Sigmund Freud devoted an entire work, Jokes and Their Relation to the Unconscious, published in 1905, to the proposition that humor is one of the primary mechanisms through which unconscious content bypasses the psychic censor and reaches expression. The joke, he argued, is always about something. The laughter is the release valve for a tension that existed before the punchline. More recent research has confirmed and extended this framework. A 2010 study published in the journal Psychological Science found that subjects who were asked to express personal concerns through humor were rated as more authentic by observers than those who expressed them directly. The humor created a kind of permission. The joke format says, "This is serious. Also, we don't have to treat it as serious. You choose." This is why the office joker is often the person with the most complicated relationship to the office. Their relentless humor is a pressure valve for something that cannot otherwise be expressed in a hierarchical professional environment. The class clown is often the child most acutely attuned to the social dynamics of the classroom and most anxious about them. The comedian's autobiography almost always has a difficult childhood in it. Charlie Chaplin, Richard Pryor, Robin Williams, Dave Chappelle. The pattern in the lives of great comedians is striking. Pain converted into craft. Darkness mined for its most surprising angles. The laughter that other people experience as pure pleasure is built on something that cost the person making it a great deal. The practical implication for you is this. When someone makes a joke about something repeatedly, pay attention to what they're joking about. Repetition is data. The topic that a person returns to again and again, always diffusing with humor, always finding the angle that generates a laugh, is very often the topic they most need to speak about seriously and feel unable to. The same applies to your own humor. The next time you make a joke, especially a self-deprecating one, notice what you just joked about. Notice whether you've made that joke before. Ask yourself, If I took the funny away, what would I be saying? Sometimes the answer is just that something is funny. But sometimes the answer is something you've been trying to say for years and haven't quite known how. Law 13. Flattery is information. It reveals what the flatterer wants. Flattery is from the teeth out. Ralph Waldo Emerson. Someone tells you that you're the most capable person they know, right before asking you to take on an additional project. Someone calls you generous and warm, right before asking you to lend them money. Someone tells you your judgment is impeccable, right before asking you to endorse their terrible idea. You already know this pattern. What you may not have fully integrated is just how reliable it is, not as evidence of bad people, but as a navigational tool. Unsolicited praise, offered at unusual moments or with unusual intensity, almost always precedes a request, not because people are cynical calculators, but because flattery is a social lubricant that the human brain reaches for automatically when preparing to ask for something it's uncertain about receiving. Robert Cialdini, in his landmark work Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion, documented what he called the liking principle, one of the 6 core mechanisms of social influence. People are far more likely to comply with requests from people they like. And one of the fastest ways to increase liking is through sincere seeming praise. The word seeming is important here, because the research shows that even consciously insincere flattery has measurable effects on the target's behavior. A study published in the Journal of Marketing Research found that flattery from salespeople increased purchase likelihood, even when consumers knew the flattery was motivated by commercial interest. The rational brain knows the compliment is strategic. The emotional brain doesn't entirely care. The warmth generated by praise activates reward circuitry regardless of context. This does not mean all praise is suspect or that compliments are always manipulative. Genuine appreciation exists. The difference lies in pattern and timing. Praise that is consistent, not performance-linked, offered freely without proximity to a request. This is probably authentic. Praise that arrives suddenly, intensely, and immediately before an ask is probably instrumental. The skill you want is not cynicism, it's calibration. When someone says something unusually flattering, hold the warmth of it without letting it cloud your judgment. You can feel appreciated and still think clearly about what's being asked of you. You can enjoy the compliment and still evaluate the request on its own merits. The deeper point is this: what people choose to flatter you about tells you what they think you care about most. If they praise your generosity, they believe your generosity is a lever. If they praise your intelligence, they believe your vanity around intelligence is a point of entry. What they reach for, in the moment when they want something from you, reveals what they think your soft spots are. That's useful information about them, and if you pay close attention, about yourself. Law 14. The words people use most often reveal what they fear most. Language is the house of being. Martin Heidegger. Listen to how someone talks for long enough, and a pattern will emerge, not in what they say once, but in what they say repeatedly. The person who qualifies every statement with, "I could be wrong," but the person who mentions being busy in every conversation. The person who circles back to themes of fairness or betrayal or being taken for granted, regardless of the nominal subject. Repetition in language is rarely accidental. The cognitive linguist George Lakoff has demonstrated extensively that the metaphors we use for abstract concepts are not decorative. They structure the way we actually think about those concepts. We don't just say relationships are work because it's a convenient figure of speech. We say it because work is the cognitive frame through which we experience the relationship. The language both reflects and reinforces the mental model. James Pennebaker at the University of Texas has spent decades studying the relationship between language and psychology, and his findings are consistently surprising. In one notable line of research, he analyzed the language used by people before and after significant life events, divorces, bereavements, health crises, and found that the use of function words, pronouns, prepositions, articles, was far more predictive of psychological state than content words. People who overused the pronoun I were more likely to be depressed. People who used more, we were in more satisfying relationships. The structure of language was revealing things the content was not. More practically, pay attention to the vocabulary of anxiety. The person who regularly uses words like always and never, the absolute extremes, is showing you that their fear doesn't believe in nuance. The person who frequently uses conditional language, if that's okay, I don't want to be a burden, just my opinion, is showing you their relationship to their own right to exist. The person who regularly speaks about control, fairness, and betrayal is showing you where they expect to be hurt. The most powerful application of this is in listening to yourself. Most of us are much more aware of others' language patterns than our own. But if you can start to notice your own repetitions, the complaints you make on loop, the qualifications you insert automatically, the themes that keep surfacing in your stories about your life, you will find a map of your own interior terrain. Your repeated language is, in a very real sense, your unconscious speaking out loud. It's telling you what it's preoccupied with, what it hasn't resolved, what it's still waiting for. Listen to it the way you'd listen to a friend who kept circling the same topic in every conversation. What are they actually trying to say? What do they actually need? The answer is usually something more fundamental than the words suggest. And the words are as good a starting place as any. Law 15. What people refuse to talk about rules their lives. What we don't examine, we repeat. Every family has one. Every friendship has one. Every organization has one. The subject that is technically available for discussion but practically untouchable. The thing everyone knows and nobody says. The elephant in every room that people arrange themselves carefully around, without acknowledging its presence for years. The psychologist Edwin Friedman, working in the tradition of family systems theory, documented what happens to systems, families, organizations, communities, when they organize themselves around an unspeakable topic. The topic doesn't disappear. It doesn't lie dormant. It becomes the gravitational center of the system, bending every other interaction toward itself, without ever being named. The family that cannot discuss the alcoholic parent cannot, it turns out, discuss anything with full honesty. The organization that cannot discuss its dysfunctional leadership cannot discuss strategy, culture, or performance with full clarity. The unspeakable thing colonizes everything around it. The mechanism was studied in remarkable depth by researchers looking at intergenerational trauma transmission. Dan Bar-On at Ben Gurion University spent years interviewing families of Holocaust survivors and perpetrators alike and found a consistent pattern. The children and grandchildren of people who had lived through unspeakable experiences were profoundly affected by the silence, by what was not said, far more than they often knew. The silence was not the absence of communication. It was communication. It said, "This is too dangerous to speak. This thing can destroy us." And the children, hearing that message in the silence, organized their lives accordingly. In individual psychology, the dynamic is similar. The wound you never speak of doesn't heal. It becomes a room in the house that everyone walks around, that informs the architecture of everything, that you are constantly, exhaustingly managing the approach to. Every life has its locked rooms. The question is whether you're managing the lock or allowing yourself to become managed by it. The therapeutic insight here is as old as psychotherapy itself. Naming something changes your relationship to it. Not immediately, not completely, but the act of bringing an unspeakable thing into language, even private language, even a journal, even said aloud in an empty room, initiates a process of differentiation. The thing that was fused with you begins to become separate from you, a thing you have rather than a thing that has you. The practical step is not necessarily to announce your secrets to the world. It is to find at least one place, one person, one page, one honest conversation with yourself, where the thing can exist in language, where the elephant has a name. The relief people report from this, even when nothing externally changes, is consistently described in the same terms: lighter, as if something that had been consuming energy without your awareness suddenly stopped. What you refuse to talk about rules your life, not because silence is weakness, but because silence is maintenance. Every day you maintain the silence is a day you are spending energy on the management of an avoided truth. That energy could go elsewhere. The question is whether you're ready for what goes elsewhere when the maintenance stops. Part 4. The truth about ambition, success, and failure. The uncomfortable engines behind achievement and the hidden costs of winning. Law 16. Most ambition is fueled by shame, not vision. Shame is the lie someone told you about yourself. Anais Nin. Ask a highly driven person why they work as hard as they do, and they'll give you a vision. They'll talk about impact, about excellence, about building something meaningful. And they're not lying. At the conscious level, this is what they believe. But if you could get underneath that narrative, if you could listen to the 3 a.m. voice, the one that drives them into the office at dawn and won't let them rest when they should rest, it usually sounds less like vision and more like fear. Fear of being ordinary. Fear of being exposed as not enough. Fear of becoming the person they were told they'd become if they didn't prove themselves. This is shame-driven ambition, and it is extraordinarily common among high achievers. Brené Brown's research at the University of Houston, spanning over a decade of qualitative interviews and quantitative studies, identified shame as one of the primary drivers of both extraordinary performance and extraordinary dysfunction. Her finding was counterintuitive and important. Shame doesn't motivate people to do better. It motivates people to do more, which is not the same thing. The driven, shame-fueled person is not moving towards something. They are running from something. And the problem with running from something is that you can never get far enough away. The neuroscience is instructive here. Shame activates the brain's threat detection systems, the amygdala, the stress response circuits, in ways that mobilize action but degrade quality. Research by Jennifer Beer at UC Berkeley has shown that shame-prone individuals are more likely to make poor decisions under pressure, less likely to take creative risks, and more likely to persist in failing strategies because abandonment feels like another confirmation of inadequacy. The signature of shame-driven ambition is the goalposts that keep moving. Every achievement should, theoretically, provide relief, but it doesn't, because the achievement was never really the point. The point was to silence the internal accusation of inadequacy, and no external achievement can permanently silence an internal voice. The voice adjusts its demands, the goalpost moves, the treadmill accelerates. Contrast this with what psychology researchers call intrinsic motivation, doing something because it matters to you, because it's interesting, because it expresses something genuinely true about who you are. Edward Deci and Richard Ryan, developers of self-determination theory at the University of Rochester, have documented across hundreds of studies that intrinsic motivation produces better quality work, greater persistence through difficulty, and more genuine life satisfaction than extrinsic or shame-driven motivation. The question to sit with is honest and uncomfortable. What are you running from? What is the voice you're trying to silence with your achievements? Not to stop achieving, but to understand what you're doing and why. Because the person who achieves from genuine vision, from authentic care, from real alignment between their values and their work, has a very different relationship to their life than the one who achieves to quiet the accuser. Both may produce impressive results. Only one of them is building something that can give them peace. Law 17. Success changes people, and almost never in the ways they expected. Be careful what you wish for. You just might get it. There's a fantasy most people carry about achievement. In it, the achievement solves the problem. The money removes the anxiety. The recognition fills the hollow place. The power resolves the old hurt. And maybe for a little while, it does. Maybe there's a window, a month, a year, where the achievement and the feeling of being enough roughly coincide. But almost everyone who gets to the other side of a major goal reports the same thing. It was not what they thought it would be. This phenomenon has been studied extensively under the somewhat clinical name of the hedonic treadmill, formalized by Brickman and Campbell in 1971, and repeatedly replicated since. The core finding: people rapidly adapt to positive changes in circumstances. The raise feels significant for about 3 months. The new house feels remarkable for about 6. The promotion feels like a transformation until it becomes, through the alchemy of routine, simply the new normal, and the gap between where you are and where you want to be reconstitutes itself at the new level. But the adaptation isn't the only thing that changes. Success changes the social environment, and the social environment changes the person. Research by Danny Miller, published as the Icarus Paradox, documented how the very qualities that drive people to success tend to be amplified by success to the point of self-destruction. Afraid of self-destruction. The focus that made the entrepreneur brilliant becomes the tunnel vision that isolates them from their own organization. The confidence that allowed the leader to take necessary risks becomes the arrogance that makes them unable to hear important feedback. There is also the loneliness that almost nobody talks about. A study by Harvard Business Review found that nearly 50% of CEOs reported experiencing feelings of loneliness in their role, and that this loneliness negatively affected their performance. The summit is less populated than the valley. The people who knew you before your success relate to you differently. New people want things from you that have nothing to do with who you actually are. The trust that felt natural before the rise becomes complicated and effortful. And then there is the question of meaning. Viktor Frankl, who developed logotherapy after surviving Nazi concentration camps, argued that human beings can endure almost any how if they have a sufficient why. What success tends to do is remove or complicate the why. The fight for survival, economic, professional, social, was paradoxically a source of meaning. When the fight is won, the meaning that sustained it can evaporate, leaving a person with everything they wanted and no clear reason to continue wanting anything. None of this is an argument against success. It's an argument for preparation, the psychological work that most people postpone until after they arrive. The inner work, the self-examination, the development of genuine relationships and genuine values doesn't become less necessary once you get there. The person who has done that work can receive success without being undone by it. The person who hasn't will find that success, in some important ways, simply amplifies what was already there, including the parts they were hoping it would fix. Law 18. People sabotage themselves precisely when success is within reach. Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. Marianne Williamson. You know someone like this. Maybe you are someone like this. Everything is lined up. The work is done. The opportunity has arrived. And then something happens. A missed deadline. A sudden doubt that paralyzes action. A conflict that appears from nowhere at exactly the wrong moment. A decision that makes no logical sense and sets everything back. And you're left wondering. What happened? Self-sabotage happened. Not as a conscious choice. Nobody decides to sabotage themselves. But the unconscious has its own agenda. And that agenda is not always aligned with what the conscious mind wants. Gay Hendricks, in his book The Big Leap, named the mechanism with the useful phrase upper limit problem. The idea is this. Each of us has an internal thermostat set for a certain level of success, happiness, and love. When life exceeds that setting, when things go consistently better than the thermostat thinks they should, the system self-corrects, not toward more success, toward the familiar level. The mechanism is anxiety, and the behavior it produces varies by person. Getting sick, picking a fight, making a reckless decision, procrastinating past a critical deadline. The psychological roots of this go. Research on self-concept by William Swan at the University of Texas and others consistently shows that people are more motivated to maintain a consistent self-concept than to experience positive outcomes. If your self-concept includes person who doesn't quite make it, then making it feels like a threat to identity coherence, not a triumph. The brain treats it as a problem to be solved, and it solves it by producing behavior that restores the familiar equilibrium. Imposter syndrome is a related phenomenon, first documented by psychologist Pauline Clance and Susanna Mess in 1978 while studying high-achieving women. It has since been found to affect approximately 70% of people at some point in their careers, according to a review in the International Journal of Behavioral Science. The experience of imposter syndrome, the persistent belief that you are not actually as capable as others believe, that your success is luck or error and will soon be exposed, is a form of self-sabotage at the level of belief rather than behavior. It primes the system to confirm the fear. The way out is not to think more positively. That's wallpaper over a structural problem. The way out is to examine the belief that sits under the sabotage. What do you believe you deserve? What do you believe is possible for someone like you? What happens in your internal landscape when things go too well for too long? The answers to those questions are, in a very real sense, the limits of your possible life, unless you choose to examine and challenge them. The examination is uncomfortable. The ceiling you discover is almost always lower than you'd like. But a ceiling you can see is a ceiling you can raise. The ones that operate in the dark are the ones that rule. Law 19. Failure is often the first honest conversation you have with yourself. Failure is just another word for education, if you're paying attention. We spend most of our lives carefully managing the story we tell about ourselves. We curate our wins, soften our failures, frame our setbacks as temporary and our successes as deserved. We maintain, with enormous effort, a narrative of competence and direction. And then something fails. Really fails. Publicly, privately, thoroughly. And for a moment, the narrative collapses. That moment, the moment of collapse, is terrible. It is also, if you can stay present in it, instead of immediately trying to rebuild the story, one of the most informative moments you will ever have. Carol Dweck's research on growth mindset at Stanford documented the striking difference between how people with fixed and growth mindsets process failure. Fixed mindset individuals experience failure as evidence of fundamental inadequacy. It means something permanent about what they are. Growth mindset individuals experience failure as information. It means something temporary about what they did. The same event, processed through two entirely different frameworks, produces either paralysis or learning. But Dweck's framework, useful as it is, doesn't capture something deeper that failure reveals: alignment. The failures that teach us the most are not the ones where we tried hard and fell short. They're the ones where we find ourselves asking, in the wreckage, whether we actually wanted what we were pursuing in the first place. Frederick Buechner wrote that the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep need intersect is where your vocation lives. Failure often reveals the gap between where you actually are and that intersection. The business failed, and in the failure, you discover you were never interested in the business. You were interested in proving something to your father. The relationship ended, and in the ending, you discover you had confused familiarity with love. The career stalled, and in the stalling, you discover that you chose it for reasons that no longer apply. Research on post-traumatic growth, a field pioneered by Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun at UNC Charlotte, found that a significant proportion of people who experience major setbacks report meaningful positive psychological changes in their aftermath. Greater clarity about what matters, deeper relationships, a stronger sense of personal strength, and a greater appreciation for life. This is not the same as saying failure is good. It is saying that failure, processed honestly and with adequate support, can produce growth that success rarely catalyzes. The practical implication: when you fail, resist the impulse to immediately construct a new story. Sit in the ruins for a moment and ask not just what went wrong, but what does this reveal about what I actually want, what I actually am, where I was misaligned. The answers are usually in the wreckage, if you're willing to look. Law 20. Most people would rather seem busy than admit they are lost. Beware the barrenness of a busy life. Socrates. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that is not caused by too much work. It is caused by work that is disconnected from meaning. You know this feeling if you've ever arrived at the end of a very full day. Meetings attended, emails answered, tasks completed, and felt not satisfaction, but a vague, unsettling emptiness. You did everything, but you're not sure what any of it was for. This is the exhaustion of directionless motion, and it is epidemic. The hustle culture that dominates so much of contemporary professional life is in significant part a collective response to a collective loss of direction. If you're always moving, you never have to stop and notice that you don't know where you're going. The motion is not just productivity, it's anesthesia. Tim Crater, in a widely shared essay for the New York Times, wrote about the busy trap, the cultural compulsion to fill every available hour and to report being busy as evidence of a life well lived. Being busy, he observed, had become a status symbol and a defense mechanism simultaneously. It says, I matter. I am needed. I am too important to stop. And underneath all of that, please don't ask me to sit still and reflect, because I don't know what I'd find. Research by Malia Mason at Columbia Business School on mind wandering found that roughly 47% of our waking hours are spent not fully engaged in the task at hand. Mind is somewhere else, thinking about something that isn't happening in the present moment. More strikingly, her research found that where the mind wanders is predictive of life satisfaction. People whose minds wander toward positive futures are happier. People whose minds wander toward rumination and unresolved problems are less so. The significance of this for the busy person is not subtle. All that busyness is partly a mechanism for preventing the mind from wandering, specifically from wandering toward the uncomfortable territory of what do I actually want from this life? Because that question, once asked honestly, demands an answer, and the answer, if it doesn't match the current life being lived, demands change. And change is frightening and effortful and uncertain. The antidote to directionless busyness is not idleness. It is contemplation, the deliberate creation of conditions for honest self-examination. This is what the retreat, the Sabbath, the long walk alone was designed for across essentially every human culture. Not to produce rest, but to produce truth. When you slow down enough for the question to surface, the question almost always surfaces, the real question, not the one you've been answering by staying busy. The question is, what am I doing this for? Not in the abstract, but specifically. What is the actual life I am trying to build with these hours? Where are they going? If you can answer that question honestly, and the answer satisfies you, then the busyness is genuine and purposeful and sustainable. If the answer makes you want to change the subject, you've found the thing worth examining. Part 5. The truth about systems, society, and collective behavior. The dark architectures that shape mass behavior, and how few ever notice. Law 21. Every institution prioritizes its own survival over its stated purpose. Large organizations cannot really deceive themselves about unpleasant truths because those truths are known to too many people, but they can compartmentalize them, avoid discussing them, and take no action. John Gardner. Here is a test you can apply to almost any institution you encounter. Ask what it was created to do. Then ask what it actually does most of the time. In a healthy, well-functioning institution, these should be closely aligned. In a mature, established institution, they very often are not. The phenomenon has been named mission drift, but that phrase is too gentle. It implies an accidental wandering. What actually happens is more systematic. As institutions grow, they develop internal constituencies, people whose jobs, status, and identity are tied to the institution's continued existence in its current form. These constituencies develop naturally and without particular malice, an interest in the institution's survival that is distinct from, and often in tension with, the institution's mission. Robert Mitchell's identified this pattern in 1911 in his study of the German Social Democratic Party, an organization explicitly committed to democratic principles that he watched. He called it the iron law of oligarchy. All organizations, regardless of their stated principles, tend over time toward domination by a leadership class whose primary interest becomes the preservation of their own power. The examples in contemporary life are not difficult to find. Schools, founded to educate children, often spend more energy managing compliance and preserving administrative structures than facilitating genuine learning. Healthcare systems, founded to heal people, frequently optimize for reimbursement codes and liability management, rather than patient outcome. Here's regulatory agencies, founded to protect the public, often become captured by the industries they regulate. Philip Zimbardo's research on the psychology of systems, work that grew out of his controversial Stanford prison experiment in 1971, concluded that evil is less a property of bad individuals than of bad situations and broken systems. Good people, placed in systems that reward bad behavior and punish good behavior, tend to adopt the system's values over time, not through dramatic moral failure, but through a series of small accommodations, each of which feels defensible in isolation. Understanding this does not require cynicism. It requires structural awareness, the ability to see the system you're operating within, understand whose interests it actually serves, and make informed decisions about how much of yourself to invest in it, and in what ways. You can work within a broken system without being consumed by it. You can serve the mission while being clear-eyed about the institution's drift from it. But you cannot do either of these things if you're operating under the illusion that the institution is what it says it is. It is. The question worth asking about every institution in your life: what does this system actually reward? What behavior does it actually select for, as distinct from what it claims to select for? The gap between those two things will tell you everything about the culture that actually exists, as opposed to the one described in the mission statement on the wall. Law 22. The rules are made by those who benefit from them. The first thing a man will do for his ideals is lie. Joseph Schumpeter. Most social norms present themselves as universal, reasonable, just, the way things naturally are. And for the people they benefit, they more or less are all of these things because the benefit is so naturalized as to be invisible. When a rule works in your favor without your noticing, you experience the rule not as privilege, but as common sense. This is what Pierre Bourdieu called doxa, the body of beliefs that are so thoroughly taken for granted that they don't need to be argued for, because they are simply treated as the way the world is. The rules governing property, labor, education, speech, and social status that favor the groups who made them are experienced by those groups not as self-serving arrangements, but as natural facts. The history of social rules is largely the history of this dynamic. The rules that defined who could own property, who could vote, who could enter professions, who could testify in court, who could marry whom, these were all, at the time they were written, presented as rational, natural, and for the general good. They were written by the people they served and experienced as neutral by those same people. This is not ancient history, the financial regulations that favor institutional investors over individuals, the intellectual property laws that protect the content libraries of large corporations, the zoning regulations that preserve the character of wealthy neighborhoods at the expense of density and affordability, the tax structures that benefit capital over labor. Each of these is a contemporary rule that was written by, or in close collaboration with, the parties it benefits most, and presented, in each case, as economically rational and socially optimal. Joseph Overton identified what is now called the Overton window, the range of policies considered acceptable in mainstream public discourse at any given time. What the concept reveals is that this window is not fixed by logic or public preference alone. It is shaped by deliberate effort by the think tanks, media outlets, political movements, and interest groups that invest in moving it. The range of the thinkable is, in significant part, a manufactured range. None of this means all rules are corrupt, or that no social norm serves a genuine public interest. Many do. The point is epistemological. Before accepting any rule as natural or necessary, ask who benefits from it as it stands. Ask who wrote it, In what context, with what interests at stake? The answer will not always reveal something sinister. Sometimes it will reveal something entirely reasonable, but the habit of asking, the refusal to accept this is just how things work as a satisfying explanation, is the beginning of real structural understanding. Developing structural awareness without descending into nihilism requires holding two things simultaneously: the recognition that the rules are constructed by interested parties, and the belief that better constructions are possible. Cynicism says, the game is rigged and therefore not worth playing. Structural awareness says the game is rigged and therefore worth changing. The difference between those two positions is the difference between withdrawal and engagement. Law 23. Collective outrage is engineered more often than it is organic. The most effective way to destroy people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history. George Orwell. You're watching the news or scrolling your feed and something makes you furious, really furious, the kind of anger that wants to share, comment, react. You feel certain in that moment that your reaction is your own, that you arrived at it independently through honest engagement with the facts. And maybe you did, but maybe you also followed a path that was very carefully laid for you. The engineering of public emotion is not a new phenomenon. Edward Bernays, Sigmund Freud's nephew and the father of modern public relations, published Propaganda in 1928, in which he wrote with striking frankness about the mechanisms by which public opinion could be manufactured, emotional responses triggered, and mass behavior shaped, not through rational persuasion, but through the systematic manipulation of unconscious desires and fears. He was describing techniques he had personally developed and employed. What Bernays pioneered in the 20th century has been industrialized and algorithmically amplified in the 21st. The research on social media engagement is by now extensive and consistent. Platforms like Facebook, Twitter X, and YouTube are optimized for engagement, and engagement is disproportionately driven by content that produces moral outrage and social division. A 2021 study published in Science Advances analyzed 12.7 million tweets and found that moral emotional language in political messages increased retweet rates by approximately 20%. Moral emotional word. This is not a conspiracy. It is a business model. Attention is the commodity. Outrage is the most reliable attention generator available. The algorithm is not trying to make you angry. It is trying to keep you on the platform. And anger, more than almost any other emotional state, is sticky. It generates response. It produces the dopamine loop of righteous validation and tribal solidarity that keeps people scrolling. The result is a population that is, by design, in a state of near-permanent low-grade outrage about an ever-rotating series of targets. The specific target matters less to the system than the outrage itself. Different platforms serve different outrage markets, left and right, progressive and conservative, but the underlying mechanism is identical. You are being sold your own anger, and you are paying for it with your attention, your time, and in many cases, your relationships. Reclaiming the sovereignty of your own emotional reactions requires recognizing this dynamic without becoming indifferent to genuine injustice. The goal is not to care. It is to care about what actually matters to you in ways that you arrived at through your own reflection, rather than what an algorithm determined would maximize your engagement on a Tuesday afternoon. A useful practice. When you feel strong outrage, ask it to slow down. Ask where it came from. Ask whether the event that triggered it is as certain as it feels, and whether your reaction is proportionate to your actual knowledge of the situation. Ask who benefits from your outrage, who is amplified, who gains resources, who gains power from the anger you're feeling. The answers won't always change your reaction. Sometimes what made you angry is genuinely worth anger. But the habit of asking restores some of the agency that the machine is designed to remove. Law 24. Most revolutions replace one hierarchy with another. Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. The who. There's a seductive idea that has driven human political imagination for centuries, that if you could just get rid of the current corrupt order, something genuinely better would emerge. That liberation from oppression would produce a society organized around justice, that the revolution would deliver what it promised. Manzabi is not encouraging on this point. The French Revolution, which proclaimed liberty, equality, and fraternity, produced within a few years the Terror and then Napoleon. The Russian Revolution, which promised to overthrow the Tsar in the name of the workers, produced Stalin. The Chinese Revolution produced Mao. The Iranian Revolution replaced the Shah's authoritarian monarchy with a theocratic authoritarian republic. The Arab Spring, which seemed briefly like the birth of genuine democratic movements, ended in Egypt with a military coup more repressive than the regime it replaced, and in Syria with civil war. The pattern was identified and named by the Italian sociologist Vilfredo Pareto as a circulation of elites. Pareto observed that what revolutions typically accomplish is not the elimination of elite structures, but the replacement of one elite with another. The revolutionary vanguard, who, organized in opposition to power, tends upon victory to become the new ruling class, and tends, with striking consistency, to reproduce many of the abuses of the order it displaced. The psychological mechanism behind this was studied by Robert Cialdini in the context of role behavior, and by Philip Zimbardo in his prison experiment. People adopt the values, norms, and behaviors of the roles they occupy. A person who spent years fighting oppressive power tends, upon acquiring power, to begin justifying uses of power that they would previously have condemned. Not always, not inevitably, but often enough and reliably enough that the pattern cannot be dismissed as coincidence. This is not an argument for conservatism or complacency. It is an argument for structural design. The movements and revolutions that produce durable progress tend to be the ones that obsess about institutional design, about how power will be distributed, checked, and balanced after the revolution, rather than focusing exclusively on defeating the current enemy. The American founding, whatever its enormous and well-documented failures, benefited from founders who had read Montesquieu, who understood the corrupting tendencies of concentrated power, and who built structural constraints against it. The question to ask of every political movement, including those you support: what specific mechanisms does this movement propose to prevent itself from becoming what it is fighting? What constraints does it build against its own future abuse of power? A movement that has no good answer to this question, that responds to it with irritation or dismissal, is a movement that has not reckoned with the most persistent truth of political history. And that failure to reckon is the first step on a path that has been walked many times before. Law 25, the darkest truth. People know. They simply choose not to look. Knowing what's right doesn't mean much unless you do what's right. Theodore Roosevelt. We have arrived at the last law, and I want to be honest with you about what it says. It doesn't say people are ignorant. It doesn't say the truth is hidden in places people can't reach. It says something harder. Most of the time, people already know. They know what's wrong in their relationship. They know what their body is telling them. They know that what they're doing isn't aligned with what they say they value. They know the news story is more complicated than the headline. They know the system they're participating in has costs they're not accounting for. And they have developed, with considerable sophistication, the practice of not looking at what they know. Stanley Cohen, a South African sociologist, spent his career studying what he called states of denial, the various mechanisms by which individuals, organizations, and entire societies manage the awareness of uncomfortable truths. His book, States of Denial, published in 2001, documented three primary forms: literal denial, it didn't happen; interpretive denial, it happened but it doesn't mean what you think it means; and implicatory denial, it happened, it means what you think it means, but it doesn't require me to do anything. The most common form Cohen found is the third. The most important knowledge that people manage not to act on is the knowledge they already have. This isn't weakness. It's often the rational response to an information environment so saturated with problems that acting on all of them would be paralyzing. There's a concept in psychology called psychic numbing. documented by Paul Slovic at the University of Oregon, which describes the way our emotional response to large-scale suffering diminishes rather than increases as the scale of the suffering increases. We feel more for a single identified child than for 100 unidentified ones. Our emotions are, in a real sense, overwhelmed by the size of what they are asked to respond to. So people choose not to look, not uniformly, not permanently, but selectively and strategically in the domains where looking would be most costly. The marriage they don't examine, the health symptom they don't investigate, the political complicity they don't acknowledge, the climate number they don't follow, the behavior in their organization they don't report. Each of these is a place where the truth is already present at the edges of awareness, and something has decided, unconsciously or semi-consciously, that the cost of full awareness is higher than the cost of managed ignorance. The reason I call this the darkest truth is not because it condemns anyone, is because it forecloses the most comfortable excuse. You cannot say about most of the things that matter most in your life, "I didn't know." You probably knew. The question is whether you were willing to sit with the knowledge long enough to let it change something. That willingness, the choice to sustain awareness in the face of its cost, to look at what you've been not quite looking at, to let the truth do its work even when the work is uncomfortable, is not a one-time act of courage. It's a daily practice, and it is, I think, the most important practice available. Not because knowing is the same as doing, but because doing begins, always, with knowing, with looking, with deciding that the truth, however inconvenient, is worth having. That's the invitation of every law in this book. Not to become darker or harder or more cynical, but to become clearer, to see with eyes that have stopped requiring the world to be more comfortable than it is, to carry that clarity not as a burden but as a kind of freedom, the freedom of someone who no longer needs illusion to sustain them. Conclusion and integration. From darkness to discernment. Let's return to the word at the heart of this book, dark. Some may wonder, is this pessimistic? Is it meant to make you distrustful, cynical, or exhausted by the world? The answer is no. But it requires a shift in how you understand what a dark really means. This darkness is not negativity, it is clarity. It is like an X-ray in a doctor's hand. When a doctor tells you there is a fracture, they are not being pessimistic. They are being precise. The problem already exists. Seeing it clearly is simply the beginning of healing. You cannot fix what you refuse to name. You cannot change what you refuse to see. So what I hope you take from this book is not a set of weapons, but a deeper awareness. Because the most dangerous way to read this material is to use it only to judge others. If all you see now is what's wrong with people around you, then you've missed the most important part. These patterns are not theirs. They are human. They are ours. The biases, the emotional wounds, the hidden motives behind ambition, the love that sometimes disguises control, these are not exceptions. They are part of all of us. And the real skill is learning to see them within yourself, without turning that awareness into self-hate. There is a difference between suspicion and discernment. Suspicion assumes the worst and shuts everything down. Discernment sees clearly, but stays open. Open to complexity, open to contradiction, open to the truth that people are more than their worst behavior. To see clearly is not a privilege. It is a responsibility to understand power and choose not to abuse it, to understand pain and choose compassion over manipulation, to see how outrage is engineered and still choose where to place your attention. That is not cynicism. That is maturity. A life built on clarity is not always comfortable. It asks more from you than a life built on illusion, but it is a freer life and a far more honest one. If you've followed both parts of this work, you may be asking, what ties all of these laws together? There is a structure. These laws move through 3 layers of self-deception. The first layer is how we deceive others, the masks we wear, the roles we perform, the subtle games we play to be accepted, admired, or in control. This is the most visible layer. The second layer is deeper. It is how we deceive ourselves, the identities we cling to, the stories we repeat, the emotional patterns shaped by past wounds. Here, the deceiver and the deceived are the same person, and that makes it harder to face. The third layer is larger than the individual. It is the systems we live within, institutions that claim to serve, but often don't, media that amplifies outrage, structures that quietly shape what we believe is normal. At this level, deception is not personal. It is built into the system itself, and each layer feeds the others. If you don't understand yourself, you become easier to manipulate. If you don't understand the system, you take everything personally that isn't. To see the full picture, you must move between all three. Together, these laws form something like a map, not a perfect map, but one that shows the parts most people avoid, the hidden, uncomfortable, unexamined sides of human nature. And a map is only useful if you are willing to use it. If something in these pages felt familiar, uncomfortable, but true, that is where the real work begins. What comes after awareness? Let's end with the only question that matters. What do you do with all of this? Because awareness alone is not enough. To see clearly and still live the same way creates a quiet kind of suffering. You know the truth, but your life does not reflect it, and that gap becomes a burden. But there is another mistake too. Moving too fast, trying to change everything at once, turning insight into overreaction, seeing manipulation everywhere, diagnosing everyone, living more in analysis than in reality. The answer is not in extremes, it is an integration. In what can be called embodied awareness, not just understanding a pattern, but feeling where it lives in you. Not just identifying behavior, but understanding why it exists. Not just deciding to change, but giving that change time to become real. There is one truth I want to leave you with. Clarity without compassion becomes cruelty. This kind of awareness can be misused. It can turn into superiority, into cold judgment, into being right, but disconnected. That is not the purpose of this book. The goal is not to stand above human complexity, but to move within it more consciously, to see yourself more honestly, to see others more humanly, and to carry both truth and compassion at the same time. Because in the end, living what you know is a discipline, not perfection. You will still make mistakes, but a commitment to face yourself honestly again and again. A commitment to choose awareness over avoidance. A commitment to live in alignment with what you see. A life without illusion is not heavier. It is lighter, because illusion is work. Constant, exhausting work. And when you finally put it down, you feel the difference. That lightness is what waits for you on the other side of clarity. That is gone, but something better, a clear mind, an open heart, and a life that is truly your own. Go live it honestly.